Brush tool. Brush palette. Hi guys, today we'll continue to explore the fascinating settings of the brush tool and we'll start with a texture overlay. Open Photoshop. I have already opened the brush palette and prepared the file. Let's take a soft round ordinary brush about 500 pixels in size. I have 508. Open the brush settings and let's look at the texture. Texture option allows us to put some texture on the brush tip. The texture is here. There are a number of default textures here. You can also upload some of your own textures by clicking on the gears and selecting the set of textures that you like. For example, I will select Artist Surfaces, and the software offers me to replace or edit. Let's choose Edit, and in this case, at the end, at the very bottom, I got the textures that I have chosen. In addition to those textures that I installed in the software, we'll learn how to create textures ourselves in the future. Let's go back to our brush. I'll apply this texture. The texture is right here. Let's see what settings we have. Well, first of all, let's see what our brush looks like without texture. Right now I have an ordinary white brush, soft. I click, and this is the tint I get. I'm doing all this on a new layer. And now let's try to apply a texture. So I set the multiply mode. It stands by default. And see what happens in this case. That's it. This is the result. By the way, scale option just determines the size of our texture. For example, if I reduce it, then the texture will be smaller. I get a very smooth texture. So I increase the size to maximum. Here we can adjust the brightness and contrast. For example, you can do this, and then we'll have such stripes. That's it. And we can do it like this. And in this case, the stripes will be almost invisible. Similarly, you can adjust the contrast. By the way, we can invert our texture. For example, if I cancel the inversion, then I will have white stripes on black. And if you invert, then you will have black stripes on white. Like that. Now I would like to get large white stripes without any tinting effects. By the way, I have a brush of white color and I get the stripes. You can increase or reduce the brush size. Let's draw along the edge of the cat. By the way, we can also change the level of transparency of the brush. We can fix some areas with an eraser. I take a semi-transparent eraser so as not to completely erase, but only partly. That's what we had, and that's what we got as a result. Let's look at other settings. We have a texture each tip option below. I think it's clear to you that it means that each subsequent tip will have the texture that we have chosen. Then there are the blending modes, which in general are identical to the layers blending modes. Depth implies how much texture will appear on your brush. The higher this parameter, the more noticeable the texture will be. See, the texture is shown here. And if I reduce the depth, then my texture will be much more blurry. Therefore, it's better to increase depth for drawing the fur of a cat. The depth jitter implies a depth change from stroke to stroke. And this happens similarly to all other operations that we have considered before. Once again, note that I did all the manipulations with the brush on a separate clean, specially created for this layer. And let's move on to the next setting, which we haven't considered yet. It's called a dual brush. This setup is somewhat similar to the setup we just went through, but it doesn't mean applying a texture to a brush, but mixing two different brushes. And as a result, you'll have a completely new brush. With the help of a dual brush, we'll now put a print, and let's start by choosing a brush. So, we'll need to choose two brushes. The first brush is the main brush. That will be at the heart of all this, which will be at the heart of our print. And the second brush will add the texture of the first brush. Let's choose a brush. I will now use a brush that was installed in early versions of Photoshop. In new versions, it is located in the Legacy Brushes folder, so we need Legacy Brushes. And choose a brush from Special Effects, Brushes. If suddenly you don't find this brush, then don't worry. I will also add this brush to the additional materials for this lesson, and you will be able to use it in the same way as the second brush. You will also find it in additional materials. So we take this brush. Let's see what this brush looks like in its original form. Here we get such tip when using this brush. And let's choose the second brush. Let's see how it looks. And here we will choose such a brush. And look at what kind of tip it gives. Therefore, in order to overlap the texture more harmoniously, it is better to make the sizes of the first and second brushes more or less the same. So, I hope that you have already downloaded the necessary brushes and you remember how to do it. And we have created a new clean layer on which we will work. We choose the first initial brush. I have taken it just from the top menu of this palette, since we have opened it recently. Then go to the brush settings, choose a dual brush, and now we choose the second brush. So here it is. So see what we get in this case. I click and this is the effect, but I would like this texture to be still, let's say nicer. I mean the texture that overlaps. And we come back to the size of the brush. Let's set the size of the second brush close to the size of the first one. And let's see what we get. And in this case, we get a print like this. We can reduce our brush a little more and make, for example, another one like this to make this print more expressive. We'll reduce it a little more and do it like this. That's what we got as a result. I will not talk about the other settings because it is absolutely similar to settings in other sections. But now I think it is a good time to tell you about such an option as saving the brush. For example, you have created some kind of a brush that you really liked and you are completely satisfied with its settings and you want to use it in the future. In this case, you select this icon at the very bottom of the brush palette, click on it, and now you can set the name of your brush. So we can even check the box to save the size of the brush in the set and click OK. Let's see where our brush is. If we open the brush settings now, then you'll find our brush at the very bottom. And look, here is our brush. That is, in the future, I will be able to use it, having created it once. Let's now talk about other parameters. Let's move on to the transfer parameter. I think that in principle everything is obvious here, but still, let's take a look. Take the brush that we have just created, and we can see what kind of stroke it gets. If we added opacity, then everything becomes immediately obvious. Some areas of the stroke will be more transparent, and some of them less transparent. By the way, in order to draw a straight line, you need to hold down Shift. I hold down Shift at the beginning of our line and at the end, and I get a straight line like this. The same can be done vertically. For example, if we need to make a straight line at an angle, I hold down Shift in the same way and we get a straight line. Now I have removed the opacity jitter and set the float jitter. But, to be honest, I don't see much difference between these two parameters. Consider the following parameter, which is called noise. I take the usual soft round brush. Let me remind you what its tip shape looks like. Let's take a closer look. And now I'm going to edit noise to this brush. I click again, and I think the difference is obvious to you. This parameter gives the brush some grain. As for the brush pulse section, we will not consider it now. These options work better when working with a pad, and their characteristics will be quite obvious. If you take a pad and try to adjust them, you'll see how exactly your pad reacts to certain settings. And let's move on to the next parameter, which we hasn't considered yet. It is called wet edges. So look, here we have our soft brush, which we already know how to draw. That's how it draws. And let's say we added wet edges. And the brush begins to draw like this, like a straw of watercolor paint. Because when we paint with water paints, this is how the pigment is disturbed along the edges of the stroke. And you can use this setting if you want to draw something similar to watercolors in Photoshop. The following build-up parameter works like airbrushing. If it is active, you can put a tip shape and hold the mouse button. Your tip shape will spread further and further from the point you will click, like this. With the smoothing option enabled, you'll have much fewer of these kind of notches that sometimes occur. But text texture means that no matter what you do with your brush, the texture that was installed in it will not be affected. This was the last item of the brush settings. And let's get to the homework. Your first homework assignment will be to create a texture overlay on the brush. and to create such an effect on a black cat, but of course you can experiment and choose some other textures. The second homework assignment will be to create a brush overlay. By the way, I draw your attention to the fact that this parameter will only work if the path sensitivity buttons are disabled in the upper menu. It is this button and this button. As material for this lesson, of course, I will touch to you all the brushes that I used, but there are no barriers to your creativity. And if you want to use other brushes and create some kind of unique design based on this lesson, I will be only glad. And it's all for today. It was Peter Romanov and AIM School. See you next time.